literature outside of the New Testament that presents Jesus, or an adoptionist view of Jesus?
I don't know of any first century Christian literature outside the New Testament for certain.
Okay.
I mean,
that's okay. Except maybe some of the apostolic fathers or something like that.
I take all the apostolic fathers to be either at the beginning of the second century or maybe the very, very end of the first century. Mm-hmm. The only non-canonical Christian document I would say I might be willing to put back into the first century would be the Gospel of Thomas.
Okay. And would Thomas possibly present an adoptionist view of Jesus in your opinion?
No.
Okay.
It's Valentinian. He's gone the other direction.
Okay.
He probably believes that Jesus never was maybe fully human.
Okay. So in your opinion, I would agree. You're not aware of any first century literature outside the New Testament that presents an adoptionist view of Jesus. All right, second question.
Wait a minute, can we clarify this?
Sure.
How can you make that point when we don't have any literature outside the New Testament of the first century? It's
precisely.
Not like we're saying, why? It's not like that makes a point that therefore adoptionism isn't around all over the place.
I agree with you. I'm just asking that question, okay? Second, do you think Paul or Luke were adoptionists?
No.
Okay. So here's my point. You're saying that there are these different Christologies that we have in early Christianity. Now we know Paul, who is an apostle, certainly regards Jesus as God. All right, he's an apostle. He knows the other apostles, as we talked about last night, Galatians 1, Galatians 2. You know, they certify his teaching, his gospel message in alignment with theirs. Certainly that the identity of Jesus has got to be part of that. All right, so we see the apostles most likely are regarding Jesus as God. Are there other views of Jesus in the first century? You say, okay, well, there's maybe some hints in Luke, Acts, and Romans, but neither of the authors of Luke, Acts, or Romans are adoptionists. They're certainly not. The point I would want to make is I think that your argument that and I know you're not the only one to do it, I know Bart Ehrman does it, I think that's a pretty weak argument. And the reason being, the only evidence you have are a few ways of possible interpretations in Luke and Paul of an adoptionist Christology when neither of them accept an adoptionist Christology. I admit that Psalm 2:7, when you read it, "You are my son, today I've begotten you," wow, that is certainly a text that adoptionists would want to grab onto. And so you have Luke use this verse twice, one in the context of Paul, and then if I were to grant you that he uses that at Jesus' baptism, which I wouldn't, but if I were to grant that, you'd have that, plus you'd have Luke say Paul says that in Acts, and then you have the author of Hebrews says it twice. And yet the author of Hebrews, even though he uses that twice, in chapter 1 he says that Jesus created the heavens and laid the foundation for the world. My point, and I'll end with this, if adoptionists were around in the first century, I don't think we'd find Luke and the author of Hebrews using Psalm 2:7 when it could so easily be used by an adoptionist. It seems to me that the more plausible scenario is adoptionists weren't around in the first century, and so you have Luke and Paul and the author of Hebrews using these things freely to show, hey, God approved Jesus at his resurrection. God approved Jesus and reaffirmed him at his baptism. And it was the adoptionists that came in the second century that read those and misinterpreted them.
Is there a question there?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I would just say, I don't believe that's how most historians do history of religions. I think what we do is we see that there definitely are adoptionists in the second century who not only are reading these texts that we might read, but they're seeing the dove come down on Jesus, and they say, oh, the Greek word for dove is peristera, and if you add up all the letters in peristera, you come up with the number 801. Well, that's proof that Jesus became divine at his baptism, because 801 is what you also get when you add up the Alpha and the Omega. So that's divine command. Now we know there are Christians in the second century doing this.
There are Christians in the 21st century doing it.
And I think most of us historians don't approach the text with a tendency to make them as unified as possible in the first century, only to come apart into wild diversity of Christianity in the second century. I think most of us just assume that if there were adoptionists in the second century, it's just as highly likely that there were some in the first century.
Wouldn't it be like saying the same about Gnostics, though?
Well, no, we can tell, we can show when Gnostic kinds of ideas sort of started coming about. We've got enough historical texts. We can relate them to what's going on in the developments of Middle and Late Platonism. No, it's not at all like Gnostics. We can be fairly certain that there weren't Gnostics in the sense that there were in the 3rd and 4th centuries in the first century church.
Well, see, I would say the same thing for adoptionists. We don't have any evidence that there were adoptionists in the first century.
That's because the evidence from the New Testament, which is the only place we have any source for any early Christian texts, you reject. So the fact
on good grounds, though, I think.
I think you do. I mean, I think the fact is, the very fact that you have texts that second century scribes are editing to make them non-adoptionist indicates that those people are worried that these texts either came from or were being used by adoptionists very early. And I don't think it's an unreasonable proposition to say that fully adoptionist Christology doesn't make it into the New Testament, because the New Testament starts becoming codified much later in the second century, and by that time anything that was adoptionist is just not going to be included by the Orthodox scribes who were doing it. That seems to me a much more historically sensitive way of imagining the growth of early Christianity than to imagine a kind of harmonized, homogenized, universalized Christology of the first century that explodes into confusion in the second century.
All right, but that's discussing canonicity, which isn't really part of this. I'm basing my case for Jesus' claim to be God on the earliest sources that we know of, and those that can be traced to the apostles in terms of Paul. And then when I'm using the synoptics, I'm talking about multiple attestation, like this apocalyptic Son of Man. You said you don't think Jesus claimed to be the apocalyptic Son of Man, but I showed that this is in every layer of the gospel sources. Mark, Q, M, L, John, from A to Z. And it's in Paul as well, and it's in multiple literary forms: biography, sayings, literature, letter. You really can't ask for any stronger form of multiple attestation than that. So it seems that Jesus certainly regarded himself to be this apocalyptic Son of Man, this divine figure. How would you answer my argument for that?
I just say that you are entirely too generous in what you're willing to accept as historical. You're not really willing to take a critical approach to these texts at all.
But critical doesn't mean skeptical. Critical means I'm not bringing my biases or my presuppositions to the text. I'm looking at these, and when I say, okay, I'm not approaching the text as though they're divinely inspired or that they're even generally trustworthy, I do the same thing that skeptical scholars would do. And in your book, you say multiple attestation is one of the ways that we get to things that appear historical. And I'm saying it's not only just in two sources, it's in every layer of the gospel tradition. It's in Paul, and Paul even says, this is a logia of Jesus that has come to us about teaching about his return as the apocalyptic Son of Man. I don't know what else you'd want.
Because I think you're completely ignoring what I think is another very important tool if you're going to talk about the historical Jesus, which is simply to say, what pieces of their story about Jesus, what sayings, are they not likely to have invented to support what their own beliefs were? The things that look like they go counter to their belief structures, those even get more historical weight. So that's why I said the Mark passage where Jesus seems to be saying that he's not God, I give it extra weight because the people who ended up writing the New Testament did believe that he was God in some sense. So if you have the small pieces in the text that seemed to survive Christian editing, later Orthodox editing and thinking about that, you give those extra weight. So since the New Testament is actually written by people who all believe Jesus is the Christ, that when Jesus says, I am the Christ, well, you just don't give that as much weight as when there are places where it seems like he's not making messianic claims for himself. So that's just one of the fundamental things. I just believe methodology, you just look at for multiple attestation, well, of course you're going to get more stuff when it's something that supports the beliefs of later Orthodox Christians, because that's the stuff they want to be there. It's the stuff that seems to go against their beliefs that gets more weight in any decent historical Jesus reconstruction, in my view.
Yeah,
So
like the criterion of dissimilarity. I understand. I appreciate that.
And so, I think, for example, that those passages where Jesus seems to be saying that somebody else is the Son of Man and not him should be given more historical weight, precisely because the Christians, by the time they wrote these texts, they took Jesus to be the Son of Man. They took Jesus to be the apocalyptic Son of Man. So those passages should be given much less weight, and any passages where Jesus seems to be saying somebody else in the future is the apocalyptic Son of Man, and I'm just the forerunner for him, those passages should be given more historical weight.
I'm fine with giving them weight. Let me have this one thing here, and then we can move on. I'm fine with giving them weight. I agree with you there. But in Mark, Jesus speaks of the Son of Man 14 times. Of those 14, 11 of them, he's crystal clear that he's referring to himself. There are 3 of which there's some ambiguity that exists. Mark 8:138, and I gave my reasons why I think that's Jesus referring to himself, because just 7 verses earlier, he calls himself the Son of Man. Mark 10:35 through 45, he is certainly referring to himself in that sense when he says he's going to sit as Son of Man on a glorious throne. Wow, well, that is something the Son of Man does. And then you got Mark 14, the mother of all Son of Man verses, where he says he's the Son of God, he's the Messiah, and you're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at God on the right hand of power. They charge him of blasphemy. I guess I could ask you, since it's not blasphemy to be a Messiah, not blasphemy to claim to be the Son of God, if Jesus was not claiming to be the Son of Man here, what grounds do they have for charging him with blasphemy?
Number one, I think that you could talk about Son of Man without it being blasphemy. You could talk about Son of God, and it would be blasphemy. You could talk about claiming to be Messiah, and it would be blasphemy. I think you've been entirely too clean with saying this always means this always means this. No, these words mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. I don't think the trial scene is at all historical. I don't think any of the disciples knew what went on at Jesus' trial. I don't even think Jesus probably had a trial. So I don't think any of this goes back to the historical Jesus, when these sayings. But I think that you can imagine how the high priest, an upper-class Sadducee, fully in control, how he could have seen it was blasphemy only because a lower-status, ignorant peasant from Galilee was claiming to be the royal Messiah. That itself, without even claiming to be divine, that itself could be considered blasphemy by somebody of that class. So I just think that you can't be so clear. And the basic way you got there is what I object to. You're going through counting passages, and you're saying, okay, there are more of these kinds of passages than the other kinds of passages.
A whole lot more.
Yeah, and of course there are a whole lot more. Mark believes Jesus is that kind of Son of Man. He's writing the gospel.
So then why would what are you disagreeing with me with?
Mark's trying to make the point. Mark's preaching. He's not recording history. He's not a newspaper recorder, even if they did get history right sometimes. Mark is not a reporter of what Jesus said. He's writing a story to try to convince his audience that, yes, Jesus is the Son of Man who suffered but will come in glory in spite of his suffering. It's in his interest to portray Jesus as that Son of Man, so he's doing it. He's not reporting words of Jesus. So when every once in a while a word of Jesus that doesn't sound like it's Mark's own theology slips through, that's when you feel like you've got something that gives you a lot on the history. Not when you have 18 occurrences of Jesus saying what Mark believes he's supposed to say.
So it sounds to me anything that goes against your view of saying that Jesus did not claim to be divine, you want to dismiss, even though it's multiply attested, and the best kind of multiple attestation we can ask for doesn't matter.
No, it's just a historical assumption that if you have a bunch of texts that teach that Jesus is divine, they're all written and published by a group of people who believe that Jesus is divine. It's not surprising to find these texts talking about Jesus being divine.
Right.
It's precisely when the texts seem to go against the interests of their own authors that you have something. And I think that's when you have these weird places where, for example, Jesus never openly claims divine status for himself in the Synoptic Gospels unless you take these terms that you say must mean divine status, and that's just simply not true. Son of Man does not need to mean divine status. You have to basically introduce a reading of the Son of Man passages that you get from a couple of other passages, which I admit they're over there, and you have to say this is precisely what they mean in the Synoptic Gospels.
And I have Paul too, right?
Well, Paul's not one of the Synoptic writers.
He's writing before them.
Yes, and you can't interpret each of the different documents in light of others. Paul's just one early Christian source among many others.
But he's an apostle, and he knows the apostles, and it seems that they're teaching the same thing.
We have no way to recover how much of Paul's theology can be traced back to the original apostles. Absolutely no way to know that.
If Paul is teaching that Jesus is God, and according to Galatians 2, he runs the gospel he preaches past them to ensure he hasn't been working in vain, and they certify his teaching is in alignment with theirs, it seems to me that if they're preaching the gospel about Jesus, his identity has got to be part of that. And if Paul is saying Jesus is God, it's more likely that they were also saying Jesus is God.
I don't doubt that, actually. I think the resurrection experiences that some of them had connected with the fact that he was crucified for somebody's claims that he was Messiah. I think that combination caused them to say, he is the Messiah. He is like the risen Messiah, and he's going to be one of these glorious Messiahs. And I think that's what caused them to start worshiping him as Lord, and that's what caused them to start considering that he's divine in some sense, although I think it took a long time for any kind of equality to God the Father to develop. It just didn't happen on, day 4 after Easter. So I imagine that the belief that Jesus was divine in some sense arose very early, possibly even with the first proclamations of his resurrection experiences. That I just don't think you can retroject that back into Jesus' own life.
Okay, one more question for you. I'll make a point, and then I want to see how you respond. Just a moment ago, you said when all the Gospels are saying, Jesus is this apocalyptic Son of Man figure, or at least Mark's saying it, you say, well, we really can't believe it because that's what he believes, and he's wanting us to believe it. Should we throw out histories of the Holocaust written by Jewish historians, or histories of slavery in the United States written by African American historians, because they also have their biases and agendas in wanting to write it?
No, you do exactly the same thing. You say the piece in their story that seems to betray their story has the best chance of being historical. And I'll give you an example. Joseph Smith claims that he translated the Book of Mormon miraculously from golden plates that he had. Now, there's a problem there that he dictated to his wife, I can't remember what, 100 pages, 200 pages of translation of this. And William Harris, who has at first been kind of skeptical, but then kept wanting to see it. He kept wanting to see the plates, and Joseph Smith wouldn't show him the plates. He wouldn't even show his wife the plates, although his wife says that she felt them one time wrapped up in linen on the table in the same room where he translated. He didn't actually look at the plates to translate. He looked in this box or hat thing, darkness, and translating stones and seeing stones. The thing is, though, they tell us the story of how Joseph Smith gave the pages that he had written, he had already translated, to Harris, so Harris could take them away to show Harris's wife, who was skeptical of the whole thing. Harris came back much later than they expected him, distraught, because he could no longer find that document. He had lost it. They didn't know whether Harris's wife had stolen it and hidden it. And Joseph Smith was scared to death to go back and start translating again because he was afraid that whatever he published later, that was those first 100 or so pages of the Book of Mormon, would be shown not to match the previous 100 pages that Harris's wife had squirreled away. Now, to me, that tells me something. Why would they pass on that story, which could be so detrimental to them? The story in itself makes Joseph Smith sound like he faked the whole translation thing in the first place. If he just translated the first 100 pages and sent them off to Harris's wife, why not just sit down with the same magical stones you did it and just translate it again? He wouldn't do that. So he came up with a story of why he was going to translate different portions of the Book of Mormon now, because he simply, and he admitted to at least his friends and family, he was afraid those original pages would come up and people would use them against him. I take that whole story about those first pages that he translated and were lost to be, if anything in Joseph Smith's history, absolutely historical. Because he would never have made it up, and it goes against his interest. That's comparable, I think.
Okay. Thanks, guys. We're going to move into some Q&A from the audience, and is the Q&A ready for the PowerPoints? Okay, so we're going to ask a few questions to these scholars from you lovely folks, and then after that, we're going to get Craig Evans to ask one question to each of you as well.
Oh,
So-
great.
It's Judgment Day, Mike. So the first question is for Dale. What is the source of evidence to confirm the texts have been edited? And where can we read this for ourselves? Here.
Go out in the lobby and buy my book. Actually, I do spend a lot of time working through the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles, and to show how I believe you can see the very authorial process of the author himself. Most of us believe that Luke used the Gospel of Mark. So one of the things we can do is set the Gospel of Mark here and the Gospel of Luke here and see what does he seem to be taking from Mark, and then how does he change it? How does he edit it? But Luke seems to be doing that with other sources also. And so I have argued in, this is the book called New Testament History and Literature. It's basically written versions of my lectures at Yale that are online if you want to see them rather than read them. And I use the speech of Stephen. What is that?
It's a spider getting ready to come down on your head.
Okay, so Greg, he asked me if I knew how to use a mic like this, and I said, I used to be in rock bands and stuff, you know? And he said, would you sing? So, I don't like spiders and snakes, and that ain't what it takes to love me. Okay.
This is on YouTube, you know.
Great. I actually try to show that I believe you can see the seams of editing in Acts when the author of Acts takes a speech, the speech of Stephen, that I think he must be getting from a different source, precisely because it doesn't agree with his own theology. The speech of Stephen contains certain theology that I believe does not agree with the writer's own theology about the temple and the Mosaic law. But for his own purposes, he puts this speech into his work. And I think by seeing where he puts it and how he puts it, you can see his editing process at work. So within the text of the very text in the New Testament, you can see evidence that authors are editing other people's text to fit in their text and their own text. I think the author of Ephesians was using Colossians as a model for his letter. And I believe Colossians was using Paul's letters to model his letter. But I think Colossians was written by one person, Ephesians by another person, and they were all using each other. I think you can see how the author of 2 Thessalonians used 1 Thessalonians, but edited it to fit his own purposes. So I think you can see it in the New Testament. The second place you can see them is in text criticism, and Bart Ehrman is the best person to show this, how second-century authors, Christian authors, are changing the text in the New Testament to make the New Testament more orthodox. And I think he does a brilliant job of showing that editing process at work.
Thank you. Mike, it seems clear in John that Jesus regards himself as divine. How historically accurate is John in your view?
It's a fine question. Scholars refer to what's called the ipsissima verba and the ipsissima vox. Ipsissima verba would be the precise words of Jesus. Ipsissima vox would be the voice of Jesus, kind of like a paraphrase. I think in John we have a lot of the ipsissima vox. I think we're seeing John paraphrase a lot of what Jesus said. He probably takes more literary liberties of any of the four Gospels do. But stuff that he would have been allowed to do as a biographer in his day. So as I've said this evening, I think you can find the same Christology in Paul that you have in John. Like if you compare the hymn in Philippians chapter 2, with John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14, you've got the same Christology there, the exact same Christology. And you've got Paul, who believes in a pre-existent Jesus. You've got John, who believes in a pre-existent Jesus. There are so many different things that are similar. It's just John is going to present the ipsissima vox of Jesus. And he does some other liberties. He dislocates certain stories and puts them in a different context in order to draw theological points. Plutarch does this kind of stuff, although not theological points. Plutarch does it. Tacitus does it. Theon in the first century said that's a proper way of writing history and biography, and chides Thucydides for not doing it. So I think John's fine in what he does. So I do think he presents an accurate portrait of Jesus, historically accurate portrait of Jesus. But a portrait is different than a photograph. I think if you're looking at a photograph with more precise details of what it might actually have looked like, you're going to find that in the synoptics. But the portrait takes Jesus and is going to paraphrase it some and gives us a crystal clear portrait of who Jesus thought he was and who John thinks he was.
Thank you. Okay, we're back to Dale. Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. And if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. How can these be interpreted as not addressing pre-existence?
They are talking about pre-existence. This quotation is from the Gospel of John. And as I said, I believe that the high Christology of making Jesus pre-existent is found in some parts of the New Testament, the Gospel of John and Paul included. I, unlike Mike, believe that John's Christology is not exactly like Paul's Christology, because I think I still see a subordinationist Christology in Paul, and I don't believe I see a subordinationist Christology in John. But pre-existence, yes, that's there in John. But I actually don't take the Gospel of John to have very much information that's going to help the historian construct a historical Jesus.
Thank you. Next question is for Mike. Please qualify what you mean by "in some sense" in reference to Jesus' deity.
Well, that's a good question. That's tough. I guess if I were to say, I don't know that the New Testament authors are crystal clear on this, and that's why I want to state this as a preciseness to the ambiguity. If I could put it this way, I'd say if God has some sort of a divine DNA, Jesus shares that DNA. So yes, there's a subordinate relationship here. It's within a divine relationship. But from what I'm reading in the New Testament authors, and especially Paul, and how the Jerusalem apostles would have viewed it, and for me, that's the most important. It's more important than what Mark or John or Matthew or Luke think about it. It's what Paul and the Jerusalem apostles were thinking about it, and they certainly regarded Jesus as divine, as equal to God in terms of his very nature, but in terms of the divine relationship, they all considered Jesus to be subordinate to the Father.
Okay. Next question is for Dale. You seem radically skeptical of the four Gospels as eyewitness accounts. If we can only trust Paul, who is not an eyewitness, could we then argue that Jesus is a myth?
Well, it has been argued by people, not so much by scholars now. Certainly in the 19th century, the German scholar Bruno Bauer took the scholarship of D.F. Strauss. D.F. Strauss believed that there had been a historical Jesus, but almost all the ideas about Christ were later myths that developed by the early church to reflect their consciousness of how they experienced Jesus. Bruno Bauer took that further, and so radically that he basically denied that Jesus of Nazareth had ever existed. The very invention of Jesus of Nazareth, according to Bauer, was a myth developed from the early church. I don't believe that, and I don't know any professional historian, whether they're Christian or not Christian, who believes that Jesus of Nazareth is an entirely fabricated mythological figure. And I think it's just because we believe that we have enough evidence from the Gospels themselves that Jesus existed. Paul knew people that knew Jesus existed. I just think that there are sources even outside the New Testament that mention Jesus. How reliable those are in Josephus or later texts is debated. But I think that most scholars, most historians are just convinced that that's just a bit too much skepticism that's not necessitated by the historical data. What Jesus was like during his lifetime is highly debated by everybody. But that he existed, and I think even several other things, that he was crucified by the Romans under Pontius Pilate around the year 30, that I just don't know any professional historian would doubt that. What we have to do is always start off with what we think is the likely case. And that doesn't mean it's absolutely undoubtable. It's just that's the way historians work.
Thanks. Is this the next question? Dale, 2 in a row. If not historically, on what basis do you as a Christian, not as a historian, believe that Jesus is divine?
Okay. I start off with the fact that I'm a Christian. I don't try to apologize for my faith. I don't try to defend it. I start out from the fact that I believe. I grew up believing. I find that it's meaningful for my life. As I got older and did a lot more studying, I came to shift what that meant to say I believe, to where I didn't feel like the historical construction of Jesus was a sine qua non for my faith. But if someone says, why do you believe? So the reason I believe Jesus is divine is because that's what Orthodox Christianity teaches me. That's what my church teaches me, and I'm a member of my church, which is an Orthodox Christian church. And so I take it on faith. When someone says, but what's the reason for your faith? I say there are 2 possible explanations for that, both of which I think are entirely true, although they're not the same explanation. This is what makes me a postmodernist. I believe there are 2 answers I can give to a question that come from 2 separate discourses, and they can both be true while not being commensurable to one another. I can give you the sociological answer. I believe because I'm socialized to believe by my upbringing. I just got socialized into having faith. It's a good sociological answer. I think that's true. Now, I can give you a theological answer, which I also believe is true. I believe because God has given me the gift of faith. I wake up and I take my spiritual pulse and I say, do I still have faith that the universe is a good place, that the universe has a loving reason, that love is the best reason to go on living in this universe, and that the Christian liturgy and mythologies and scripture reinforce that sense that I have? I go, yeah, it's still there. And I say, that's just a miracle. God gave me the grace of belief. And it's been a comfort, and it's been great for my life. I'm not going to defend it to you. I don't need to defend it to you. It's just there. And so I say, everybody's faith as a Christian, I think Christianity has always taught this. You cannot take credit for your faith. That's one of the reasons you can't look down on people who don't believe. Because you didn't earn anything for yourself by believing. It was a gift from God.
Great answer. Well, that's the last of your questions. But before I talk about this, Craig, would you come up, take the seat, and ask one question of each? And I'll just stand right over there, and I'll come back and grab the mic from you when you're done. So,
Can I go with you?
No. No, you're going to stay here. Stay there.
Well, thank you very much, Mike and Dale. It's been very stimulating. Good thoughts. And thank you, too, audience, for your questions. Yes, I have one question for each of our distinguished guests. And I'll start with Dale. Paul asserts in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 19, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. I've always been fascinated by this statement. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to hear what how you understand it, what you think Paul was and is saying.
I think Paul definitely believes that Jesus is divine in a sense. And I believe that he doesn't put Jesus on completely equal footing with God the Father. But if that's true, he needs to justify Jesus' role in reconciliation. And I think what that's saying does is that's Paul saying Jesus is not the reconciliator on his own. Jesus is the reconciliation of humanity to God by the agency of God the Father also. Now, as a Christian, I think we can even be more robust about that and say that that's a statement about the incarnation of the full God in Jesus Christ in all of his person. But I wouldn't want to retroject that kind of Council of Chalcedon Christology back into Paul's head. I think that the way I would interpret it is that that's admitting that God the Father, when Jesus Christ is working to reconcile the world back to God, he is working as God's agent and by God's power.
Thank you very much. Mike, let me ask you this. In your view, what is the single most important passage in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, for which a strong argument for authenticity can be made that suggests that Jesus viewed himself as divine?
I would guess, let's see, I have to think about that for a moment. I think when you're looking, now you're, let me ask you the question to clarify that. Are you saying for historical authenticity?
Yes, that's why I threw
Okay.
in the qualification about
Gotcha.
which a good argument can be made as to its authenticity.
Okay, I'm sorry then. I would do the apocalyptic Son of Man. I'd go with. Again, I think it's just crystal clear that the synoptics regard. I mean, certainly Matthew does. There's no question about that. But I do think Mark, the earliest gospel, regards Jesus as this apocalyptic Son of Man, this divine figure. And again, it's in Mark, it's in Q, it's in M, it's in L, it's in John, and it's in these multiple literary forms: biography, sayings, literature, and letter. I think that's extremely strong. And this apocalyptic Son of Man does things that only can be done to God. Again, there are exalted figures in Judaism, greatly exalted figures. But the apocalyptic Son of Man is the only one to receive worship and sit on God's throne. Nobody else gets those. So I think that's given, I think they have great claims to historicity, that Jesus actually believed himself to be this apocalyptic Son of Man. And then when we look at what this Son of Man was in 1st Enoch, 4th Ezra, Daniel, and how Jesus interpreted within the context of who he was, I think that's has a very strong claim to authenticity. So just from the synoptics, again, I think Paul is even stronger. We have to account for how Paul and the Jerusalem apostles came to that belief. But from the synoptics, I guess I'd have to go with apocalyptic Son of Man.
Thank you very much.